For more than 25 years, the United States has borrowed trillions of dollars. Today, America's national debt has grown from just $5.7 trillion in 2000 to nearly $39 trillion in 2026. But here's the question few people stop to ask. Where did all that money actually go? Was it spent on wars? Financial crises? Tax cuts? COVID-19 relief? Or something else entirely? The answer isn't as simple as many people think. Behind every $1 trillion is a major decision that shaped America's economy and its future. In this documentary, we'll take you year by year through the events that transformed a $5.7 trillion debt into nearly $39 trillion, explaining what happened, why the government borrowed so much, and what those decisions could mean for the years ahead. Let's begin. 2000. At the beginning of the new millennium, the United States owed approximately $5.7 trillion. The federal budget was relatively stable, and the economy was still benefiting from the technology boom of the late 1990s. At this point, there was no major financial crisis or war driving borrowing. 2001. Debt, $5.8 trillion. New borrowing, about $100 billion. Then everything changed. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks struck New York and Washington. America immediately launched the War on Terror. The government increased military spending, intelligence operations, airport security, and homeland security. Most of these new expenses were financed through borrowing. 2002. Debt, $6.2 trillion. New borrowing, about $400 billion. The war in Afghanistan expanded. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security. Military deployments increased, intelligence agencies received larger budgets, and defense spending continued rising. The government borrowed more because tax revenue alone could not cover these new costs. 2003. Debt, $6.8 trillion. New borrowing, about $600 billion. America invaded Iraq. Now the country was funding two major wars simultaneously. Money was spent on military operations, equipment, reconstruction, troop deployment, and veterans care. Debt continued climbing. 2004. Debt, $7.4 trillion. New borrowing, about $600 billion. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars continued. Defense spending remained extremely high. At the same time, tax cuts reduced government revenue. To cover the difference between spending and income, the government borrowed more money. 2005. Debt, $7.9 trillion. New borrowing, about $500 billion. Hurricane Katrina became one of the most expensive natural disasters in American history. Billions were spent on disaster relief while war spending continued overseas. Borrowing increased again. 2006. Debt, $8.5 trillion. New borrowing, about $600 billion. Military operations continued. Healthcare programs such as Medicare expanded. Interest payments on existing debt also increased. The government borrowed to finance both ongoing programs and previous obligations. 2007. Debt, $9 trillion. New borrowing, about $500 billion. The housing market started collapsing. Banks began reporting heavy losses. Although the financial crisis had not fully arrived, warning signs were everywhere. Government borrowing continued to finance existing spending. 2008. Debt, $10 trillion. New borrowing, about $1 trillion. Then came the global financial crisis. Major banks collapsed. The housing market crashed. Credit markets froze. The U.S. government approved emergency rescue programs for banks and financial institutions while supporting the broader economy. Borrowing accelerated sharply. 2009. Debt, $11.9 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.9 trillion. America entered the Great Recession. Millions lost their jobs. Businesses closed. The government passed a massive economic stimulus package, extended unemployment benefits, and increased public spending to support recovery. This became one of the largest annual borrowing increases in U.S. history at that time. 2010. Debt, $13.6 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.7 trillion. Economic recovery remained slow. Government stimulus programs continued. Healthcare spending increased, unemployment benefits remained high, and the federal deficit stayed large. The government continued borrowing. 2011. Debt, $14.8 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.2 trillion. The economy improved slowly, but wars overseas, entitlement programs, and interest payments kept federal spending high. Debt continued rising. 2012. Debt, $16.1 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.3 trillion. Recovery spending continued. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, defense, and healthcare remained major budget items. Borrowing remained necessary because annual spending still exceeded tax revenue. 2013. Debt, $16.7 trillion. New borrowing, about $700 billion. The economy strengthened. Budget deficits became smaller than during the financial crisis years. However, America still borrowed because government spending remained larger than government income. 2014. Debt, $17.8 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.1 trillion. The recovery continued. Most borrowing financed normal government operations including defense, Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure, and interest payments. 2015. Debt, $18.2 trillion. New borrowing, about $400 billion. Economic growth improved. Annual borrowing slowed compared with previous years. However, debt still increased because the federal government continued running budget deficits. 2016. Debt, $19.6 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.4 trillion. Healthcare, retirement programs, defense spending, and interest costs continued increasing. The national debt crossed $19 trillion. 2017. Debt, $20.2 trillion. New borrowing, about $600 billion. Donald Trump entered the White House. One of the biggest economic changes was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The goal was to encourage businesses to invest more, create jobs, and stimulate economic growth. However, lower tax rates also meant the federal government collected less tax revenue. At the same time, spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and veterans benefits continued to rise. Since government spending remained higher than government income, America borrowed another $600 billion. 2018. Debt, $21.5 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.3 trillion. The U.S. economy remained strong. Unemployment was low. Businesses were expanding. Yet the national debt continued growing. Why? Because tax revenue was still lower after the tax cuts while government spending continued increasing. Defense spending was expanded. Federal agencies continued operating. Interest payments on previous debt also became larger. America borrowed another $1.3 trillion. 2019. Debt, $22.7 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.2 trillion. Before COVID-19 arrived, America was already borrowing more than $1 trillion every year. Most of the borrowing went toward Social Security, Medicare, national defense, interest payments on existing debt, and the continuing gap between government spending and tax revenue. Few people knew that the largest debt increase in modern American history was about to begin. 2020. Debt, $26.9 trillion. New borrowing, about $4.2 trillion. Then the world stopped. COVID-19 spread across the globe. Businesses closed. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. Airlines stopped flying. Restaurants closed. Entire industries came to a halt. To prevent an economic collapse, the U.S. government approved several emergency spending packages. Money was used for stimulus checks sent directly to American families, expanded unemployment benefits, Paycheck Protection Program loans for businesses, hospitals and vaccine development, support for airlines and critical industries, aid to state and local governments. In just 1 year, America borrowed over $4 trillion. This became the largest single-year increase in the national debt in U.S. history. 2021. Debt, $28.4 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.5 trillion. Although vaccines became available, the economy had not fully recovered. The government approved additional COVID relief spending. Schools reopened. Businesses received more support. Healthcare spending remained elevated. Recovery programs continued throughout the year. America borrowed another $1.5 trillion. 2022. Debt, $30.9 trillion. New borrowing, about $2.5 trillion. The pandemic began easing. But another problem emerged. Inflation. Prices for food, fuel, housing, and everyday goods increased rapidly. To fight inflation, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates at the fastest pace in decades. Higher interest rates made borrowing more expensive. For the U.S. government, this meant interest payments on existing debt started increasing sharply. Even without a new crisis, borrowing continued because annual spending still exceeded annual revenue. 2023. Debt, $33.2 trillion. New borrowing, about $2.3 trillion. America's biggest expense was no longer only government programs. Interest payments on the national debt became one of the fastest growing items in the federal budget. At the same time, spending continued on Social Security, Medicare, defense, veterans benefits, infrastructure projects, federal agencies. The government borrowed another $2 trillion to finance these commitments. 2024. Debt, $35.5 trillion. New borrowing, about $2.3 trillion. By now, the national debt had reached levels never seen before. A growing share of every tax dollar collected by the government was being used simply to pay interest on existing debt. Meanwhile, spending continued on healthcare, retirement programs, defense, education, disaster relief, infrastructure, and other federal responsibilities. Borrowing continued because the federal budget remained in deficit. 2025. Debt, around $37 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.5 trillion. The national debt crossed another historic milestone. Interest costs continued rising because many Treasury securities issued during years of low interest rates had matured and needed to be refinanced at higher rates. America was not only borrowing to finance new spending. It was increasingly borrowing to refinance older debt and cover higher annual interest costs. This placed additional pressure on future federal budgets. 2026. Debt, around $39 trillion. New borrowing, about $1.5 to $2 trillion. By 2026, America's national debt had climbed to nearly $39 trillion. The largest reasons for borrowing over the previous 26 years included the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, the 2008 global financial crisis, the Great Recession, COVID-19 emergency relief, tax cuts that reduced federal revenue, growing Social Security and Medicare obligations, rising defense spending, and rapidly increasing interest payments on existing debt. At this stage, the question is no longer simply how much America owes. The bigger question is whether future governments can continue financing these obligations while also investing in infrastructure, education, healthcare, scientific research, and national security. The debt did not appear overnight. It represents more than 2 decades of wars, economic crises, political decisions, demographic changes, emergency spending, and persistent budget deficits. Understanding that history is essential to understanding America's financial future. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and press the notification bell so you never miss our future documentaries on finance, economics, and global events. And if you're watching on Facebook, please follow our page and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.